Hello, everyone. It looks like it's about 2 minutes after the hour, so we want to get started as promptly as possible here. Welcome to our new Ross Live series, Co-Creating the Future, where today we're engaging you in session 1, Reimagining Beyond the Restart, using Enlightened design thinking. Many of you are returning from our previous series, leading in challenging times. We welcome you back. Some of you are new to this series about co-creating the future, and we welcome you as well. It looks like we have a lot of our corporate partners from around the world on the line today. We also have quite a few of our University of Michigan and specifically Michigan Ross alumni. We have quite a few students and even parents of students and our University of Michigan colleagues, as well as some new friends. So welcome, everyone. I am Melanie Weaver Barnett. I'm the Chief Executive Education Officer at Michigan Ross. I'm joining you today from a different location from which I usually broadcast, and my Wi-Fi connection is a bit spotty, so apologies for that. If you see my video kind of getting choppy, it's probably me, not you. We're going to go over just a couple housekeeping details and share a bit of information with you, and then jump right into our session today with Professor Jeffrey Sanchez-Burks. So on the housekeeping front, you're in listen-only mode on this Zoom webinar, and the chat is disabled, but the Q&A is enabled, and we encourage you to enter your questions there. As people enter questions, others can see them, and please upvote the questions that you like the best and would most like the answers to, and we will engage Professor Burks in answering the most popular questions. We'll stop at one point along the way to take questions, and then at the end again. If you have technology issues, try getting out and back in, reconnecting. Or sometimes you need to accept the session without the video. You should be able to hear the audio and see the slides, and you will get a link later so that you can see the entire session by video. We will send that out to everyone. At Michigan Ross, we're all about the power of business to make a positive difference in the world. Everything we do is based on that core belief. And the way we do that at a high level is through the development of powerful ideas, evidence-based, research-based ideas. We use those ideas to create learning experiences that develop purpose-driven leaders, and the sole purpose of that is to have a positive impact. Positive impact on individuals, on teams, on organizations, communities, and even the world at large. So that's what we're all about, and it's part of the reason we're doing this session and this series for you and making it complimentary. Here are just a few photos of that, what I just said, in action. These are our some of our corporate executives in executive education programs learning about those ideas and applying them with research-based tools and actionable ideas that we've created. We want to make sure you know about upcoming learning opportunities with us. So you might be interested in next week's Ross Live Co-Creating the Future series topic, which is diversity and inclusion, bonuses, margins, and systems with Professor Scott Page. Scott will be able to show you mathematically why and when and how diversity matters, and also the importance of getting beyond the kind of tactics that you may hear are important and into creating the systems in your organization and the culture advantage of what he calls the diversity bonus. So we hope you'll join us for that. We also have several online programs that you can join. These are fee-based programs, and you can find them on our website, but Practicing Positive Leadership with Professor Kim Cameron and Growing and Developing Your Talent with Professor Dave Ulrich. So we hope you will get on and join us for those as well. My colleague Karen behind the scenes is going to paste that link into the Q&A so that you can see it, or the chat maybe, I think it's the Q&A. And so you can see that, and you can edit, copy, edit, paste, or you can just Google us and search and you'll find those programs. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Sanchez-Burks. Professor Sanchez-Burks, or Jeffrey, is a professor of management and organizations, and he's the faculty director of our Impact Studio at Ross. And that's a studio that was very recently conceived and put into place. And it's all about harnessing the expertise of University of Michigan resources, engaging students from across the campus, and corporate partners as well, and all for the purpose of making a positive impact. Many of the projects on which they work are based on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and they've gotten even more specific to identify where they can make the biggest and most important difference. So for example, they're working on projects to help women and minority-owned businesses and other small businesses, and in many parts of the world. Professor Burks is a behavioral scientist and a professor of management and organizations at the Ross School of Business. He has taught leaders in many, many countries around the world and in many different sectors: technology, financial services, consulting, arts and entertainment, etc. You can see them on the screen. And he's also the director of our customized programs that we do in partnership with Oracle Corporation. And he teaches in many of our other executive education programs, both customized and open enrollment, and also in our executive MBA program. Today, Professor Burks is going to share with you insights on getting ready to take your team into the future, to help to co-create with your team, to engage your team in designing for the future. And very specifically, he's going to share with you 2 challenges and the associated 2 tools that you can use to do that. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Jeffrey. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and he will start sharing his and bring himself in by video. I'm going to turn my video off and take it away, Jeffrey.
Great. Thank you. Is everything set? You can see the slides? So, welcome everyone. I wanted to, as Melanie had previewed, share with you just 2 things that have come out of our research on what it takes to help teams come up with solutions, which is needed more than ever, as well as how do you manage the group dynamics so you can accelerate that process. Let me just begin with a very fundamental truth that is really important to have as a very explicit assumption when you're working with your teams. Innovation is a probabilistic endeavor. There are tasks which involve execution, and there are certain group dynamics needed to just get things done when the problem is known, when the solution is known. But innovation, by definition, doesn't have necessarily a clear problem and doesn't have a near solution. So there's no one tool or process you could use that could guarantee success. So what you need is to have as much as you can and grounded tools and processes to increase the probability of success. So let's jump right in. Challenge number 1, how do we increase the probability of success with our teams? Now, there are many ways in which we could address this, but I want to just give you one in an effort to hopefully give you something you can put into practice right away. Let me, without trying to be offensive, try to recognize another truth, which is we can be very bad leaders at helping others come up with new solutions. Especially when we're stressed, you can imagine we tell others, we need new ideas, we need fresh ideas, think outside the box, and we'll repeat ourselves. People can become very frustrated and sort of looking at the ceiling, thinking, where are these new ideas going to come from? The Greeks, as you see from this image here, their solution was to come up with a whole series of muses. Hopefully one of them would whisper a good idea in your ear, but that may not be helpful. So when we talk about how do we come up with new, fresh ideas, new solutions that no one had thought of, out-of-the-box thinking, let me give you another perspective on this. And it's going to be around this concept of bricolage. If you look at the research that's been done for the last 100 years, some a little bit longer than others, on invention, creativity, and innovation. These are like 3 siloed research agendas within the university. Surprisingly, didn't talk to one another, but there might be some commonality. If you look at the work, for example, on invention, Royce had talked about it as a system of ideas composed of elements previously existing. By the way, this image, you can get this working if you can get the balance of the fan just right. Okay, a system idea is composed of elements previously existing. It's a little bit clunky. It's sort of an old way of phrasing it. Okay, that's invention. But what if we look at all of the research done on creativity? Turns out there's this one common theme there. As my colleague Carl Weick had talked about, it's about putting old things in new combinations. Okay, it actually doesn't sound too creative. It sounds a lot like the prior definition, but all right, we're starting to see some themes. Now, if you go over into the work on innovation, you again see this core theme. It's about carrying out new combinations. In other words, we're starting to see that what brand new is not something that had never been thought before, but about a search for elements that can be combined in new ways. Well, before we get too much further, we just have to give credit where credit is due. The Romans had actually had this insight long ago. Here in Latin, it basically translates into, it's not possible to create something from nothing. Now, this doesn't mean that there's nothing new or there's no way of creating something new, but rather than thinking outside the box or just looking at a blank piece of paper, it actually starts to provide direction. So let me give you some examples of bricolage. When they were trying to, and I actually talked with some of the engineers in this one large auto company, in the early days of coming out with the notion of airbags, one fundamental challenge they faced was how do you fold the airbag? It has to be folded very precisely so that it unfolds very quickly and precisely so that it can basically save lives. Well, you can imagine engineers thinking, well, how might we do this? The solution was not to create some brand new way of folding that had never existed. Instead, they looked to origami. Same as you see in the image in the bottom left here with heart stents, they were looking to origami. Where is their other expertise in this in order to come up with a new way of folding these heart stents that could be put into your veins in the wrist up to your heart and expanded out, again, very precisely. Hospitals, especially those that try to address the needs of children, have had problems forever in trying to allow a kid to have less anxiety and stress so that they could get the services and help they need. From an MRI machine, which can be stressful even for a human, to even going to the dentist. Well, in reimagining them over the last 10 years, rather than try to come up with some brand new way, or rather than struggle with thinking about, well, how are we going to actually relax children, they engaged in bricolage. Specifically, they searched for places that already bring joy to children, like children's museums, theme parks. And though you just see here the wallpaper that seems pleasing for a child, there's actually a whole story that goes behind this to really engage the children. Another example of bricolage is interesting, speaking of medicine, that came from this type of breast strip that Listerine had created. That was a whole new product category, by the way. That was a major invention. Basically, they said, we're going to take this liquid mouthwash, put the chemical on a strip, put it in your tongue, and deliver the medicine. In a way, it seems very similar to the old Japanese gum oblat that was put the sugar on rice paper, which may have inspired delivery methods for LSD in the 60s. Similar pattern, you're starting to see these all around. But interestingly, you see biomedical researchers looking to Listerine saying, wait a minute, we're trying to figure out better ways to deliver medicine to babies because science has shown they don't like to take medicine. What if we put antibiotics on a little strip and can put this in the baby's mouth, maybe when they're crying or just when not paying attention? There you go. So brand new inventions can actually be created more successfully by looking elsewhere, not just looking at a blank piece of paper. I had the privilege some years ago of talking with Mr. Komori, CEO of Fujifilm. Now, right now, we're seeing a lot of businesses struggle and some that we don't know will survive. Well, Fujifilm faced this. Their entire industry, film photography, was collapsing. And so one of the interesting things in talking with them is, well, I asked him, to be honest, the very obvious question of, how did you survive, unlike Kodak? And he said, well, basically what we've done is we've gotten our team together in order to ask one fundamental question. You actually put this in a book. I should grab this and show this to you. I'll share this with you another time. But anyway, so in the book, he basically captures the story of how he got his team together and asked one question. What do we know? It's interesting because in a way, he's asking, well, what bricks do we have? The team took their time to really dive deep in understanding what they know, what bricks they have inside the organization. And they came to the conclusion they know chemicals. Chemicals that interact with collagen, that's the main substrate of film. And they know they have patents on this. This is their expertise. Well, now that they have these different bricks, they could reassemble them into something new. For example, they went into whole new lines of business, like beauty makeup. Fujifilm knows how to change the appearance of collagen with chemicals. That's how they do film photography. So beauty makeup, for example, is just a chemical that changes the appearance of skin, collagen. They even have pharmaceuticals on the market. So there's a lot has been written about how organizations are thinking about new services, products, new different types of lines of business they can get into. This is a wonderful example of how Fuji did it, not by just dreaming outside the box, but trying to look at what resources and expertise are already in-house and how might we recombine those in ways that can offer new hope and new economic possibilities. But it's not easy to take these alternative perspectives. One of my favorite examples comes from a gentleman who set up shop near where I grew up in Southern California, Walt Disney, and very famously invented some of the most revolutionary, innovative ways to entertain children with Disneyland. The real one in Los Angeles, not the other one in Florida. Okay, kid decides. Well, it turns out Walt was obsessed with trying to take the perspective of a child. That should be interesting insofar as he was a child, and it's actually remarkable he had to spend so much effort to take that perspective he already had. One way of thinking of it is like this. If we have to work very hard to regain a perspective we already had, Walt was a child at one point, how much harder is it for us to gain a perspective of someone we've never been? So in trying to think about the different examples that are out there, it's not easy to just sort of pop around in our mind, in our life experiences, and sort of try to see, well, how would this problem be addressed from another context? Another example of this, trying to see things from different perspectives, even perspectives you have in your own head, comes from the story of Betty Graham Smith. So up until the 50s, professional typists had one horrible problem, a typo. By the way, there's probably some youth on this. A typewriter is like this integrated product that has a keyboard and a printer all put into one. So you type and it prints instantly. Well, there's no backspace. And so if you make an error, then you really have a problem. And if you're a professional typist, this can have career implications, cost implications, and so forth. Well, Betty Graham Smith, it turns out her hobby was to paint. One day she came up with this idea. What if I come up with a white paint that dries very quickly? I'll put in these nail polish bottles and you use the brush to type over or paint over the mistake and then type over that. She invented liquid paper. Others call it Tipex or whiteout. What's remarkable about this story is it took her a very long time to come up with this idea. Now, we don't want to beat up on her. It's a pretty revolutionary idea, but it actually is a striking example of how hard it is to connect dots that are in our head, to engage in bricolage with perspectives that are already in our own mind. In other words, she had this expertise in painting, she had this problem in typing, but it didn't naturally come to her to connect them. One might guess that while she was painting, hopefully she didn't have to think about typing, but while she was typing, she may not have had the opportunity to sort of daydream about her painting. So making these connections requires effort. So this challenge of trying to come up with some new solution, and whether that is through connecting ideas that are already in your head or looking elsewhere, is one challenge, if you were able to overcome it, that can help you come up with more and higher quality ideas. So here's the tool. When you have your team together, you don't just want them to come up with ideas individually before they talk. That's best practices. You want them to come up with as many ideas as they can, many solutions to whatever problem you give them, and then pause. And then ask each of them, tackle this same problem. Think about the same problem from a totally different perspective. How would your grandfather, how would your mother solve this problem? How would you solve this if you were 10? How would your boss solve this? How would your former colleague solve this? Have them think about real perspectives that they plausibly can think of, and then try to squeeze additional ideas out of that. You may only be able to have 2 or 3 rounds in my practice working with executives from around the world. But what you find is each time you ask them to take a different perspective, they come up with ideas that don't resemble the type of ideas in round 1. What you're trying to do simply is allow people to make better use of resources that are already in their head, that are already out there, so that you can have a greater diversity of bricks to then engage in bricolage. And I can talk more about that in a Q&A. But if I could, Melanie, do we stop here if there's a question? I don't have a chat or...
Yeah, we have a couple questions here, Jeffrey. So the first one is, what is the difference between creativity and intelligence?
Well, there has been, so starting in the 60s, mid last century, there was an effort to try to expand our sense of what is an intelligence. And there was a elaboration beyond just cognitive intelligence to say, well, there's street smart or social emotional intelligence. And then others proposed there's also creative intelligence. Now the measurements and the theories got a little bit messy on this, but there is a clear pattern in the data that there are people who are better able to engage in what we'll call divergent thinking, thinking about the problem from multiple perspectives, whereas some just try to think of it from one perspective and just persist on that. And again, since it's a probabilistic endeavor, like anything with probability, numbers matter. So if you're, and numbers and diversity matter. In fact, my colleague Scott Page will talk about this even more in the next series. You want as much diversity, not just in the team, but also in your head as you're sampling these things to move that forward. So I wouldn't think of there's intelligence and there's creativity, but you can be intelligent in your approach to creative problem solving.
Okay, very good. So they're different concepts, but not mutually exclusive and certainly related to one another. Very good. Okay, here's a couple more questions. How do we analyze ideas that about what will work or what won't work? So how do you decide which ideas are the best? And then an additional question from Chiranjeev is, how do we keep cost effectiveness in mind when evaluating ideas?
These are great questions. If I can, let me answer them in going through challenge number 2, and then we can have plenty of time to open up. But I think this gets to the heart of this question of, okay, we've actually have promising ideas. How can we accelerate their development? And by accelerate, I want to make sure we understand or recognize that, of course, accelerate may be accelerate to bury the idea, right? To no longer invest in it, because not all ideas should be invested in, but we actually have to get to that point where we can say, yes, these are the promising, these are not the promising. So this is that second challenge. And
hey, Jeffrey, Jeffrey, before you go on, sorry, there's just one specific question about bricolage. So I thought maybe we could address that one. It came in just at the moment. Okay. Could you elaborate on a little bit more on how the tool to foster bricolage actually works? Are there, you know, could you just say a bit more about how you go through that exercise? And then go.
When I'm working with executive teams, and they're not always creative or design teams, it could be engineers or whatnot, we take a challenge that they're facing and we literally have their teams generate as many ideas. We'll use Post-it notes, one idea per Post-it note. And we call that round 1. And we put those aside, we don't evaluate them. And then what I've had executives do, leaders of teams do, is prepare in advance a card that they distribute to everyone in their team. And the card says something different. But each card asks the individual to think about the problem through a unique lens. As I previewed before, how would Jane over in marketing tackle this problem? And let's imagine it's an engineering problem. How would Joe over in accounting, and everyone knows Joe, and everyone knows Jane. So have in each member of the team think about someone they actually know, and then ask them to imagine how that person would solve the problem. What's remarkable is, of course, they're not actually leveraging how that person would think. Those ideas were already in their mind. And so there's almost like this tears of frustration and happiness, because when you do this, you're getting more out of the team, and they realize all this time they haven't been doing it, there has been an abundance of resources that are already in their heads they haven't leveraged because they didn't use this tool of tackling the problem from multiple perspectives. So when you have a team, you can prepare in advance who are specific people they might know, and then have them in subsequent rounds of ideation think about how to tackle the problem through that lens. We get success rates are just, you don't even need statistics at this point, where they're like 80 to 86% of effectiveness, where people will say, I came up with more ideas in round 2 and more unique ideas in round 2.
So an untapped and deep resource that we literally all have available to us and probably are not using to the extent we could. That's a great tool
absolutely.
to take away. Thank you, Jeffrey.
From an operations perspective, we're not optimizing the resources that we already have. Absolutely. So let's imagine you get all of these ideas. The question now is, how do you actually accelerate this development, as we mentioned? Now, sorry to give you all these sort of fun words, bricolage and wabi-sabi, but as a scholar and as an individual, I feel it's important to just stick with the most appropriate term. And wabi-sabi really captures the type of group dynamic you want to create in your teams. Now, wabi-sabi is an elusive concept that originally came from art and design within Japanese society. And it actually had 2 components, the wabi and the sabi. And it has to do, with an appreciation of imperfection and impermanence. Now, if we apply this to group dynamics when you're designing solutions, think of it this way. When a team or an individual comes up with a new idea, it is incomplete. No perfectly formed idea has ever popped in an individual's head. We may get a book that gives the illusion, but it's always a collaborative effort. So ideas are incomplete. They're imperfect when they first are generated. And because it requires other people to help develop the idea, we want to also acknowledge that it's not going to stay as it is. It will evolve. In fact, you're wanting to invite others to help improve the idea. Now, let me set the context for this. What I have found, and many others have found in virtually any context where you have people developing new ideas, is when they share their ideas with their colleagues, we start to, as the kids say, front. We start to go into sales mode and talk about, this is a great idea, look at all of these things, and you may say no, and I'll say, no, you don't understand it. And I try to sell you on the idea, almost like a thumbs up or thumbs down. The alternative, what we're talking about, is to embody what F. Scott Fitzgerald talked about, is to be able to have this willingness, this humility, this ability to think, my idea has promise, or I wouldn't be excited about it. But there's also some limitations with it in its current form, and it needs to evolve. And having this sort of mixed emotions about it and taking that to the team is going to be critical. But here's the challenge. As I previewed a moment ago, people tend to overinvest in their ideas. So before a person is willing to share their idea, they want to polish it, they want to invest, they want to work on it. They want to show you a beautiful prototype, a beautiful drawing, or a 3D, or a visual demonstration of the process. As Claudia, former VP of Design and Innovation and Strategy at Procter & Gamble, had mentioned, she had this interesting hypothesis. She said, if the prototype is more raw, people are more likely to engage with you. This is what got me onto this line of research that came up all the way to the wabi-sabi component. In other words, if you actually had an idea and brought it to somebody that's more imperfect, they're more likely to engage with you. She said that typically she finds people overinvest, they bring these full-blown finished products, but when it is raw, people are more likely to say, you need my help. Some executives that I was working with a large automotive company were talking about how they discovered they were not getting good feedback about their user interface, that they had done these awesome prototypes. They had actually reduced the resolution of them, so they kind of looked more clunky, and then people were more willing to give feedback. In other words, Claudia's hypothesis is shared not only by others, but we actually have data to show her insight was right. Think about this. There's other work showing that, well, why do you need other people? Why can't I just come up with my good ideas, invest in them, and then try to sell them, and hopefully they get approved or not? Well, here's a challenge. the psychology of generating an idea is different than the psychology of selecting ideas. So one of the questions was, how do you select ideas? It turns out people who are good at generating ideas, or that mindset, is not the same as evaluating the idea. Now here's an anecdote, and I can give you greater research, more research on this if you're interested in. So one of the best-selling rock and roll songs of all time is Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones. The author of this song thought it was junk. Thought it, well, if we have to use this song as a filler, fine. Because back in the days, people listened to records. Again, this is like an old reference. Records are these vinyl discs, and you needed enough grooves or people didn't think they were getting their money out of it. And so sometimes you created a filler song so there's enough grooves in it. In other words, he was unable to recognize that was the best song he had ever written. He's not alone. Authors, movie producers, writers are similarly blind to their best works at the front end of this. And multiple studies have started to show that if you ask people, okay, you have 10 ideas, which of them do you think will be most well received in the market? And they do tests to see which ones customers actually prefer. There's a very low correlation. So we need others, not just to critique our ideas, this is important, we need others to help us identify the bright spots. Which aspect of our idea or which of our ideas actually have the most promise? Most recently, we did a study. We had both students, we had executives, we had working adults. Executives most of the time are working adults, but we actually asked them the following. Imagine you had somebody who's presenting a brand new idea. And we said, you know, in a very typical fashion, the person presents the idea and sort of shows the strength of the idea. That's the blue bar, the control condition. The maize bar is when we said for a different group of folks, imagine that the person said, look, here's my idea. It's got a lot of promise, but it's not perfect and it's going to change. In other words, wabi-sabi. We asked people, which of these presentations is most likely to get feedback, quality feedback, engagement from the audience? What you see here is there is a reliable difference. Specifically, they believed and recognized that if people were willing, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, to acknowledge explicitly this idea has promise, but it's not perfect, and it's going to change, you were more likely to get others to engage with you, much like Claudia had previewed with this. But here's the real kicker, and this is sort of the warning thing to write down. We also asked them, if the person presented like the control or the wabi-sabi, how would they be perceived in your organization? How would you perceive them? What you're seeing here is a belief that people fear admitting that the ideas are not perfect and they'll change because maybe I won't be seen as competent. Now, let me remind everyone at this moment, we're talking about sharing a very, very early stage idea. There comes a time when your idea needs to be polished, you need to present and give it your best. But we're talking about the very early stage of ideas where we actually need to more quickly get them out so that we can start to evaluate them, decide which ones to invest and move forward. That process requires some intellectual humility. You could call that wabi-sabi. But people are reluctant to engage in this for fear that they can be seen as incompetent. So there's the real paradox we need to overcome. People are basically worried. If any of you watched the Muppets, these are sort of the grumpy old guys in the back who just sort of said, I don't like this. You know, we're always sort of trying to please those who could be most critical. But it turns out what the research is showing is that if we can have that humility to present an idea as authentic as it is, imperfect, and it will change, we're more likely to get better feedback. And one of my students in our executive MBA, so Dennis Smart, she's manufacturing manager at PM Engineering, recognized this and gave me an example of how he has done this very successfully in his organization. He says, when he introduces an idea, he always couples it with comments indicating it's not set in stone. I don't have all the answers. It's definitely going to change, it may even fail. It was very insightful. He says he does get more engagement. Now, many of the other executive MBA students kind of nodded and said, yeah, I wish I had done that, or I wish this could be done more in my organization, but the culture doesn't allow for it. So there is an opportunity, you could argue there's a need for us to try to inject this wabi-sabi, this intellectual humility in our groups so that we can get ideas out more quickly and get others get others to be more invited and help improve them and sort of avoid this. So one way I think about it is not only do you want the presenters to explicitly note not just the promise, it's incomplete and will change, but you also need a culture, a group dynamic, where you don't allow this perspective to happen, but you want people to say, what are some of the bright spots to the idea? What are some of the gems of the idea? Not to just be positive for positive's sake, but given the research that the person who came up with the idea is unlikely to know the bright spots, you really need others to focus on both, not just problems, but also some of those bright spots. So what we've had seen successfully in our teams of how to do this is we have people, first of all, you have to have a group dynamic in which people sort of understand this. Then when they present ideas, we want them to present them very quick, very early on. You get very little time to invest in them. Like Claudia had mentioned, just take a stick, a pen, whatever little stuff you can just find around you and try to show the idea as quickly as possible, but explicitly note some of the imperfections with the idea. And explicitly note, you need others to help improve the idea. And then on the other side of the equation, we create a group dynamic where everyone knows the rules. And the rules are the following. After the person has shared the idea, before we get into the critiques, we need to A, help them identify the bright spots, if there are any. Oftentimes there's something like, where's a gem part of the idea? They may be totally sold that this is the best part of their idea when it's over here. And then try to engage by saying, well, how can we improve this idea? And of course, improving will address some of the faults in the idea. That's the other key component of this. So let me pause and take some questions. Those are sort of the two key tools, the bricolage and the wabi-sabi, that I wanted to share, and of course, engage you with a broader conversation.
Awesome. Bricolage and wabi-sabi. If nothing else, we've all learned some new vocabulary today. So Jeffrey, here are some more questions for you. Praveen is suggesting that companies of all shapes and sizes are going to need to create business plans for alternative futures, given where we are now. Maybe 2 or 3 of these alternative futures. And do you have any suggestions for how to apply bricolage in this kind of, for this kind of process?
Yeah, well, actually, let me take it in. So the idea that we need to have multiple contingency plans. From a wabi-sabi perspective, we're seeing this in the business school. I'm actually quite proud of the university and the Ross School's leadership in sharing very early stage ideas, not building up our contingencies and then saying, ta-da, here's the options, but rather have engaged everyone with sort of early tinkering of the ideas so that we can more quickly improve them. But at the heart of that has been saying, here are multiple things that could happen in the fall, for example, and we haven't worked them all out and we need input. So they've done that wabi-sabi. Now, in terms of trying to apply bricolage to this, I think the very specific tool or the implication of bricolage is not to just think about something that might pop into your head, but where have we seen examples where there has been a complete disintegration of one's industry, like Fujifilm? Where have we seen a mass change in the way companies deal with their customers going online? Where have we seen this happen in different countries where they came up with different solutions? So in other words, you switch from trying to invent something new by staring at the ceiling, and you become relentlessly curious to try to hunt for analogous context. Where are there similar situations like this that might help inspire ideas so that you can come up with your contingencies, bring them to people more quickly, and engage with them?
Okay, awesome. So looking at other kinds of examples, looking back in history even, can be helpful in this whole process. That's great. Thank you. So Thomas is asking about the idea that exists in a lot of companies where, you know, they expect a prototype in their innovation process, and they expect that prototype to be something more polished than perhaps you're suggesting with regard to imperfections and so on. So how do you help your company overcome that mindset and get on board with this idea of wabi-sabi?
I would argue that you can accelerate the process of getting to your polished prototype if you embed a wabi-sabi culture in the prototyping process. Meaning that if a team were to wait until the polished part to get feedback, probability is low you're going to succeed. But if you're more able, agile, not to use sort of the processing for engineering design, but if you're able to create a culture where people are sharing ideas and improving them and experimenting with them much more quickly, you can accelerate that point to the point where now you've got a polished prototype. So it's not it's not contradicting the notion that you do want to get to a polished prototype. You just need to say, what is the time and the point when I need the polished point? And then what is the group dynamics that are required to get there more quickly? And if I didn't answer this, I'm happy to let me know and we can talk some more.
Yeah, the people who are asking the questions, if you know have a follow-up or aren't quite sure about the answer, just type in another question. So Jeffrey, speaking of agile, Robert has a question about how to balance these iterative ideas of minimum viable product where we're innovating close to the edge with customers. And he inserts new paint colors as an example. So how do we balance these iterative ideas of minimum viable product where we're innovating close to the edge with customers, as in new paint colors, and also core innovation where, for example, we're building something, you know, bigger and more complex, like a new chassis or an engine? A pretty specific question, but what would you say?
I would actually go back to Claudia's point, because she's talking about working and designing with customers. So people are very familiar with design thinking or lean, even agile, all of these terms that basically say we need to involve the people who will use the thing we're trying to design. We need to involve them in the process. Amazon has a slight spin on this minimally viable product expression that I love a lot. And I got it from one of my students. We have a lot of folks who work at Amazon out of our MBA program. And it was a minimally lovable product. And I love that twist because basically it highlights not just the minimum component of it, but minimum plus just enough that the person will care to give you honest feedback and be engaged enough to help you play and improve that idea. And so when you're taking something to a customer, you need to sort of set the stage of what this is. This is not, here are two products we're taking to market. Do you prefer A or B? Right? This is much earlier on. And what a lot of organizations have found is customers can be remarkably appreciative of being involved in such early phases because they normally don't. Now, this isn't to say you take that and they're going to be able to give you all of the key insights. But if you are going to involve them, then that can be actually very helpful, and they can have a lot more appreciation for this. Again, if you're to the point where you need to present a polished component, you ditch the wabi-sabi by then. It's helped you in the early phases, but it's not through all of it. So we really need to understand that the start of prototyping to launch of this is a process, and wabi-sabi is about accelerating to the point where you can have these go, no go decisions.
Okay, excellent. I was going to ask you about that. You know, you talked about having the team take the perspective of various stakeholders, but I was wondering what you would say about actually engaging those various stakeholders in the process. And it sounds like you do advocate for that, especially with regard to customers and so on. And I know I've seen this in action in some of the programs that we run, where you've got the groups engaged in the human-centered design process, and they are actually going out and getting feedback from customers, potential customers, and others.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Melanie, we know with our executive education, You don't necessarily want a professor or practitioners to come and present to you a full-blown production, a full-blown thing. You want, others will need to be involved, and so it's better if they didn't try to do it all themselves. I was talking with a literary agent, and I was determined to self-publish the book that I'm writing, and she basically said, there's no chance. It's like taking a movie to Universal Pictures and saying, here, I want you to put your name on it. Like, no, no. We have a whole bunch of people who need to be involved in this because there's no way one person will have done it alone. And so there's this recognition we need to be a little bit more humble about how much we need of others to help improve this idea that we have to get it to that point. And I'm just putting this up here in case you want to, after this session is over, feel free to email me. I'm happy to give you resources, send you links to the research that I mentioned as well.
Very good. Someone was asking about ideas for books. I would like you to answer one more question, Jeffrey, and then we're going to honor people's time and let them have a few minutes before what is probably their next meeting, Zoom meeting for the day. So this is from Chiranjeev, and it's very pertinent to today's work environment. How do you have team engagement, especially in this idea of generating ideas, the kinds of things you're talking about, when you're digitally connected and not physically connected?
Remote collaboration. This is it's a great question. So in my Impact Studio, the pandemic happened in March and we went remote. So I had people literally in a studio and then we're working remote. Fortunately, we had been using technologies to enable remote collaboration like Miro, in addition to Slack for communication. And there are even some Google solutions which are more cost efficient. But you want tools in which people can collaborate synchronously and asynchronously. And save the time for synchronous when people are like on a Zoom call for when key decisions must be hammered out in a back and forth conversation. But digital tools in which you have people, say, posting ways of thinking about the problem, posting examples. So I'm documenting the summer for my students in the fall, all of the ways businesses locally are trying to figure out how to do this. So the traffic jams where people are waiting for takeout, the signs people are putting outside about what happens when you come into the store, where they're putting hand sanitizers, and so forth, so that we can get inspired by, well, what are some of the workarounds people are doing, where there are opportunities to improve this. So full stop, there are a number of collaborative tools to do this. Think of both the tool where people can post ideas and resources. I use Miro as an example. I don't have stock in Miro. I don't even know it's a public company, but that's one. But most importantly, make sure you have the team culture established. What do we need to do synchronously versus async? What are the possibilities to do asynchronously? We definitely need fewer Zoom meetings, in my opinion, because we're not making good use of all that can be accomplished asynchronously and saving that precious time when we come together for the quality conversations we need to happen.
All right, very good. And we did a couple of previous webinars on the idea of the concept of working from home and how to make that effective. So for the people who would like even more on that question itself, you might look back at our webinars with Susan Ashford, Professor Sue Ashford, and Professor Lindy Greer. Those are on our website, and they will give you some more ideas for dealing with working in a remote environment. So thank you. Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much. It was wonderful to have you with us today and helping us better see how to engage our teams in preparing for the future, co-creating the future in a very design-oriented way. And again, everyone, Jeffrey put his email there. If your question didn't get answered today, you can go ahead and send that to him. And we look forward to seeing you, we hope next week, with Professor Scott Page. Thank you so much, everyone. See you next week.